have an author joining us, and I got to tell you, he's been on the show before. I want to show you his book, which last time he was on the show was just to talk about this book. It's called Sword and Scimitar. The author's name is Raymond Ibrahim. He's the author of The Al-Qaeda Reader, other books, great book. And he joins us online. And before he comes on, one more thing introducing our guest today. I do want to make sure you realize that it matters a lot to understand who is giving opinions when you're listening to opinions. So Raymond Ibrahim, who's on the phone with us, he's got a website, and I'm going to let him tell me again, sadly, how to pronounce his last name correctly. But his website, RaymondIbrahim.com, has a long bio. It's a great bio. A widely published author, public speaker, Middle East, Islam specialist. He's testified all over the place. He's been on all sorts of interviews on television and radio and media. He's a well-recognized expert on the history of Islam, the history of the Middle East, and I want to talk to him about some things happening in America. So, I believe we have Raymond Ibrahim on the phone. Hi.
Hi, Debbie. How are you? Hi.
I'm well. It's nice to see you. You want to say your last name again?
You actually are pronouncing it correct, Ibrahim.
Okay, that's great. I get a touchdown there. Okay, well, I want to jump right in. You had a column not too long ago in the American Thinker. I love that website, American Thinker. And your column in American Thinker, you had the caption, "No more swords in the West, only scimitars." And you were getting at the idea that it seems as though in the West, in America, Western Europe, the Western world, we are a little bit more timid, or we're too timid in defending our culture, our identity, as opposed to, you gave as an example, I believe, in Saudi Arabia, the scimitar, the symbol of one of the symbols of Islam. They keep that in their flag. Is that right? So you used to talk about what was the point of this article. We're going to get into a lot more things, but you were talking about no more swords in the West, only scimitars.
Yeah, well, the point was, I always write about the fact that Islam today, in the modern era, if it's able to terrorize the West, it's not because it can, it's because it's being allowed to, empowered by Western sources, as opposed to historically, when Islam had no other option but to invade violently with the sword. And what got me about this particular story is its relevance to my book, the book you just showed, Sword and Scimitar. The very last sentence of that book, which is, I think, 350 pages, what I wrote is, no matter how diminished, a still swinging scimitar will always overcome a strong but sheathed sword. And I'm referring to the Islam, no matter how weak it is, because it is economically, militarily, definitely weak compared to the modern West. But as long as it's still doing what it's doing, and the West is not doing anything and not at least even protecting itself, it'll cause damage. And so in connection, it's a New Zealand rugby team, because they feel their logo, their team logo, which is basically a crusader holding a sword, is offensive, particularly to Muslims. They actually have removed it, the logo. They changed it completely. And so again, you see this, it's just a minor issue that wasn't even really mentioned in any news sources, really, because it's not that big of a deal. But again, symbolically just shows you, as you said, Saudi Arabia. Now here we have an entire nation that proudly depicts its scimitar, and underneath it, it says the Islamic creed, which is there's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger. A creed that has past and present caused so many people to get killed if they don't recite it by said scimitar. And so you can just see the the reaction of a Western. It is a team, but it's a Western element. How it's rather craven and capitulates immediately and feels scared because there's a crusader with a sword. And then on the other hand, you have Muslims who are continuously venerating their past, boldly and proudly depicting swords and, quoting Islamic history and scriptures and so forth that validates violence and conquest. And it's that, dichotomy of a sort of very weak West and a very aggressive Islam that is behind all the terrorism. Because again, I can't underscore it enough that if it wasn't for what the West itself is doing, let's say the West just said, you know what, like countries such as Poland, for example, who say we don't want Muslim migrants. Well, guess what? There's no terrorism in Poland. There's no people killing, screaming Allah Akbar and terrorizing the Polish people. So there are ways. But when you look at, how Western Europe and America and so forth are by and large responding, they're the ones who are allowing and empowering the violence and terror.
That was a great summary. I want to just mention about your book again, Sword and Scimitar, and actually the subtitle is 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. In your book, and I know you talked about it before on the show, and so we don't have to go in great detail, but there have been so many books written trying to prove that the teachings of Islam itself in the Quran, allegedly out of the mouth of the founder of Islam, Muhammad, out of imams and Islamic universities and schools around the world, there's so many people who've been trying to make the point that Islam itself actually does command devout followers to engage in jihad, to forcibly spread Islam by force, by duplicity, by manipulation, but that the duty to spread Islam is written into the core of the identity of Islam itself. So your book went after and because so many people make that argument, your book I just loved it, goes through the history of Islam as a religion that has, since the time of the founding of Muhammad, been engaged in pushing Islam forcibly onto Christian, just non-Muslim, Jewish, Christian, pagan nations, the history of thousands of years. And I can't ask you to summarize the whole history, but I think most people, to many Americans, we woke up on 9/11 and said, wow, I wonder why the Muslims don't like us. And they had no idea that it's actually woven into the founding of Islam. So can you give us a little bit of a walk through the history of the aggression of conquest Islam?
Sure, and just to add to your point, a lot of people, as you say, do make the doctrinal argument, okay? So they'll show you verses from the Quran and the life of Muhammad and his words, all of which support violence and conquest, subjugation in the name of Islam, etc., jihad. What I wanted to do with this book, though, is to say, let's lay aside the abstract, theoretical and theological argument and just see what Muslims have actually done throughout history, okay? Because the former argument, when you talk about scriptures, there's this postmodern mentality in the West that says, well, so what? The Bible has genocide in it and Joshua and violence, so who cares if the Quran has it? It's how you understand it, etc. So my point was, let's look at what really happened. And the long and short of it is, think of ISIS, the Islamic State, and what it did and what it said, and of course we were told that has nothing to do with Islam. But think of it on a much grander, much exponential scale for well over 1,000 years. And it's not just some group, it's actually the caliphs, it's the sultans, it's the absolute highest authorities in the Islamic empires who are speaking like this and behaving like this. That's precisely what happened. That's what Islam did to all its neighbors. In the book, I focus on the West, which was basically the Christian world, Europe. And, most people, as you said, they thought after 9/11, why do they hate us? What's going on, etc. But when you look at this book, the answer is, well, they've hated you from the start. And this has been the normal behavior, except it was even more graphic and more violent because they could get away with it and they could invade and they were physically, militarily stronger often. And that's why, for example, in the 7th century, you took the entire Christian world, and then that's when Islam came into being. In that first century, 3/4 of the Christian world was permanently conquered. So all of North
can you say that
Africa,
again? Say that again, that last sentence, in just the first, go ahead.
Yeah, in the 7th century, in the 600s, that's when Islam, basically the calendar comes in to being of Islam. Muhammad dies 632. The big conquests begin right after he dies. And in that time, if you looked at a map, the Christian world, most of it actually was in North Africa and the Middle East, Egypt and Syria, Turkey, all of North Africa. So that was not only the bigger part of the Christian world, it was the older and richer part. And actually, 4 of the 5 big centers were in the East. So in that first century, between, let's say, 632 to 732, 3/4 of that was conquered, most of it permanently. Places like Spain and then later the Balkans and Russia, which were also conquered by Muslims in the name of jihad, were eventually liberated. But we forget that all of North Africa and the Middle East was even more Christian than Europe. And the reason it is the way it is now is because Islam took it through extreme violence and force, just like it did with Europe. We forget Rome was sacked in 846 by Muslims screaming jihad. They were at the gates of Vienna 1,000 years later, or almost 1,000 years, in 1683. So they reached Iceland. They used to go to Iceland to enslave Europeans and sell them in the Barbary market. And it's important to keep in mind, it's not just that they were acting violently because everyone acts violently. It was always articulated as a jihad. It was always articulated the way ISIS articulates its violence, that the Quran teaches us to do this. That's what the ambassador told Thomas Jefferson in America's first war after it gained its independence. With the Barbary states, he said, when Thomas Jefferson asked him, why are you attacking our sailors? We did nothing to you. He said, you're infidels. The Quran tells us to do so. Our prophet tells us to do so. So the long and short is, think of the worst of ISIS, what they say and what they do, and that is exactly what went on for well over 1,000 years, except on a grander, more savage scale. And it's all, by the way, the book, that's what it's about, but the book's not my words. So if you look in the back, there's well over 1,000 endnotes to primary sources mostly. And I stress that because, I don't want anyone to think, well, why should I trust you? Because the sources are all there, and it's oftentimes stuff that no one quotes or translates or wants to talk about, but people in the past definitely knew about it.
I meant when I introduced you to mention that you actually obviously speak and read English fluently, but you also speak and read Arabic. And so you're able to look at primary source documents, read them yourself, not rely on the translation of others, which is one of the many things that makes your book so powerful. And I still say, I think the majority of Americans do not realize the history of Islam, because conquest Islam is a term I use, but that the very teachings of Islam itself compel devout followers to commit jihad for the purpose of spreading Islam by force. And that's what your book recounts in great detail, all the history, the battles, the information about the conduct of people and the nations conquered and the peoples killed. It's a great historical document to keep in mind as we look at our present day troubles. So now let's turn to our present day troubles. I want to ask you, obviously you're aware, as all Americans are, we had a horrific attack at the Pensacola naval station. We had Saudi Arabian nationals here with permission of America, here to train with the Americans on this in this naval base in Pensacola, Florida, and one of the Saudi nationals, a Muslim, opened fire and ended up killing innocent American soldiers. So I want to start with the idea that after that happened, there was some talk about whether America, our military, could do a better job figuring out, if we're going to bring Saudi military people here to America, can we do a better job figuring out who's going to engage in this conduct so we can prevent them from coming here then? What can we do?
Here's the problem. Excuse me. Going back to what I was saying about the history and Islam and ISIS and all that. Excuse me. If you look at the nation of Saudi Arabia, our good friend and ally, and you look at how they their society, their public education, everything about it, it again is ISIS, believe it or not. Despite the fact that, we're used to seeing our presidents dancing with them, waving swords, and of course, all the geopolitical aspects that make them our great friend and ally. Saudi Arabia, if you look at it, regularly comes out, the public education teaches everything ISIS does. They have a fatwa online. I think they took it down since I publicized it, but it was online in Arabic, and I translated portions of it. And it's from the government itself. It is supported by the Saudi crown. And it says everything that ISIS says. Why? Because it's from the Quran. So they quote the same things that ISIS quotes from the Quran. For example, there's verses that say, you who believe Muslims, do not befriend Jews and Christians. They are each other's friends. There are verses in the Quran that say you have to hate non-Muslims, Christians, Jews, atheists, whatever. And they talk about that, and they write it in the fatwa, and they call on all Muslims, not just in Saudi Arabia, to be this way. And then when you look at the public education, it's the same exact way. They teach their children to hate non-Muslims. So there's nothing that I can find, despite all the propaganda, like I said, where America tries to show Saudi Arabia in a positive image. When you look at them, they're virtually identical in their Islam, in the hate for the infidel and so forth. So in that context, when I find out that this Saudi man did what he did at Pensacola, I'm really not surprised. Just like I wasn't surprised to find out that 15 of the 19 hijackers of 9/11 were Saudi Arabian. I wasn't surprised that it was a Saudi man who masterminded Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, born and raised in that nation with that worldview, with that vision.
And going back to 9/11, it's a sad and ironic fact, but some of the hijackers also took aviation courses in Florida, including Muhammad
Yes.
Atta. So you just keep seeing the reason these things keep happening over and over, and they will continue to happen over and over, is until you accept reality. So in this case, if I'm a leader, if I'm in charge of America or any non-Muslim nation, why on earth would I take in regular people from a nation that I know is imbuing them with hatred for my people regularly? And that's exactly what's happening. And am I supposed to be surprised when one of them lashes out, or 10 of them, or 15, or whatever? It's telling that after the Pensacola attack, I think another 10 Saudis were arrested, and then even more are on the run, last I heard. So, and this is the whole point, let's stop thinking about, terrorism as a specific group. Oh, it's ISIS. Oh, it's Al-Qaeda. No, we have whole nations that are actually teaching all the bad things that ISIS and Al-Qaeda teach. Again, Saudi Arabia, prime example. I can't find anything that they diverge in their worldview from, let's say, ISIS, which we are told are evil and demonic and have nothing to do with Islam. So again, until we accept reality, then how can you respond to it?
Okay, so the reality we need to accept in America and in the West is that the violence we saw at Pensacola and at 9/11 and all the other countless Islamic terror attacks is violence that is encouraged and permitted within the core of Islamic teaching, within the Quran, taught not just at the time of the founding of Islam and the writing of the Quran, but in the words of Muhammad, and taught in this world, around the world, in mosques by imams and Islamic schools and universities, the basic tenet that because Islam is the only truth, the only right answer, that they, the followers of Islam, are justified in committing violence to spread it. And so it's all the same. It goes back to Islam itself, not particular individuals who are bad actors. Is that fair?
That's fair. It's one thing, I'm going to ban everyone from, let's say, Indonesia because it's a Muslim country. So I'm not saying you would do that, okay? But when you have a nation like Saudi Arabia, and this is a special, different nation. Remember, Saudi Arabia is the whole, forget the word Saudi. That's just the name of the ruling clan or tribe. But Arabia is the home of Islam. Arabic is the language of Islam. We use the word Arab, 22 Arab nations. It's really one, Saudi Arabia. We say 22 because they all speak Arabic. They've been Arabized by Islam and so forth. So that nation is really different. And when you look at it, it's very wealthy. When you look all around the world in all these radicalized mosques, you're going to find Saudi funding, and you're going to find Saudi literature, hate literature, basically, being, again, Saudi money. So they definitely, in my opinion, play a very large role in the Islam terror problem, much more than many other countries. But because, again, for geopolitical reasons, they're our friend and ally, and so even those who normally will call out Islam and Islamic terrorism won't really talk about Saudi Arabia because they're our friends. And so, okay, but it's a lie, and as long as you are willing to tolerate that lie, you have to accept things like this to happen.
Accept the consequences, yeah. I emailed you earlier today to mention this one story I'd read about, which was Nancy Pelosi, who is the Speaker of the House, had a meeting recently with Islamist leaders, CARE, and other organizations, encouraging her to try to work with them to get the ban, I don't even like the word the ban. We had improved vetting processes that America is going to apply for people wanting to come to America from countries that have an extreme problem with violent Islam, with Islamists being violent. And so we had, finally, after many court battles, the Supreme Court said, actually, yes, President Trump can put in place a more serious scrutiny, a more serious vetting for people coming to countries that may mean us harm. And it's not all the countries included in this executive order are Muslim majority, but most of them are. So my question to you is, do you think that we are overly, are we unfair in some way to Muslim majority countries to have the provisions in place that President Trump, did through executive order that essentially requires closer scrutiny? Do you think that we're out of line in the way we handle that?
No, because if you are objective and you're concerned about the security of your nation, and as this ban is meant to be, and as you said, look at it. There are countries on this ban that are not Muslim at all, not Muslim majority. For example, North Korea. So it's not necessarily a Muslim ban. It's a ban against nations that pose a high terrorist risk. Now, let me give you an analogy. There's a group, a well-known international organization called Open Doors that chronicles the persecution of Christians all around the world. And every year they bring out a report that shows you where the 50 top worst nations to be a Christian, and also, of course, the top 10. And habitually, if you look at this report every year, the top 50 nations, about 40 are Islamic. When you look at the top 10, about 9 or 8 are going to be Islamic, and North Korea will also be in there. So you can see it's, just because there is a heavy preponderance for one particular group does not mean that you are being discriminatory. The facts spell it out. It just so happens that, and again, if you look at the continuity and you tie it with his, that's the way it has always been. People don't understand that if you were living in Europe for centuries, the enemy was the Muslims, because they were all around the perimeter of Europe. And again, those nations used to be Christian, that perimeter. But they were conquered, and now that was the new boundary, and they were trying to get into Europe constantly. But all that history has been completely expunged, and that's why we're living in a vacuum. And then when you see, the top 80 or 90% of violence and terrorism is coming from Muslim nations, it does sound like you're picking on them, because we've been taught, everyone in every culture and everyone does the same exact thing. No, if you really want to be objective, some civilizations are better than others. And some are more violent than others, and so forth. And so you're seeing ramifications, or you're seeing that continue today, just like it was in the past. So to me, it's not surprising, though I understand why superficially it seems like you're singling them out. But if you want to be objective, they will always be in the majority.
That was a great analogy. We've actually, I'm so glad you mentioned that too, about all the violence in the world against Christians. I've actually read all that data also on Open Doors. The other kind of ideological source of violence against Christians is its vast majority coming from Muslim majority nations. The other comes from nations that are, for the most part, dedicated to communism, socialism, and simply hatred of all religious people. Okay. Raymond, I have to tell you, I think you are such a gift to the American public to get a window and a better understanding on facts, because the truth is, facts about Islam, facts about what Islam teaches, facts about the history of Islam, because Americans do want to be fair, they want to be open-minded, they don't want to be judgmental, they don't want to be discriminatory. But having facts, like the facts you present in your book, Sword and Scimitar, and in your many columns and writing, really, it helps America wake up. And until we have enough Americans aware that focusing on and protecting ourselves from violence likely to come from people who've embraced the teachings of Islam is essential to preserving our country. But people aren't going to get that idea until they understand more of the kind of things that you have shared and written about and talked about in your columns and your book. So I really thank you for all you do, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks very much, Debbie, and I appreciate all that you said, and that is in fact why I do what I do, because I do believe facts are very important, and there's definitely a huge vacuum. And the sad thing is, it's not a vacuum; it's filled with the antithesis of the facts, with lies. So it's definitely a lot of work, but it's important for everyone to know it.
It is. We'll have to save that for another day. All the lies. We'll talk about that another time. Yeah. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Debbie.
Okay, folks, I have to tell you that this information that you can get, I didn't even get to the stories. There were stories that we were also going to talk about today. We're kind of running out of time, but we have Saudi students in America, Saudi Arabian students in America, here by our invitation, with our permission. Recently, a Saudi student was arrested for having all sorts of bomb material in their college dorm room, and they weren't doing research for a class. So I love that we have the ability to talk to someone as informed and well-read and well-researched as Raymond Ibrahim, and I really encourage you to read his book.